The snow had fallen thick through the night, covering the high plains in a shroud of silence so deep that even the coyotes had quit their howling. John Merrick, a rancher whose land stretched along the northern ridges of Arizona Territory, stood outside his small cabin with his breath steaming in the pale dawn. He had just one horse left in Old Bay gelding named Tucker and a dwindling supply of firewood stacked against the wind-beaten wall. The winter had come early that year, catching the valley off guard, and many of the ranchers had already lost cattle to the cold. John was a man of quiet resolve, hardened by years of loss. The war had taken his brothers, the fever his wife, and now the blizzard seemed bent on taking what remained of his will. But through it all, he held to a principle his father had carved into him long ago. A man's worth ain't in what he owns, it's in what he gives when he's got nothing left. The wind moaned across the ridges, lifting the edges of his coat. He turned toward the barn to check on Tucker, but before he reached the door, he saw something moving through the flurry of snow. At first, he thought it was a stray wolf or a dying cow, something lost and staggering. But as it drew closer, his eyes caught the shape of two figures, small and slow, dragging through the white. His hand instinctively went to the rifle leaning by the porch post, but when he looked harder, his heart faltered. They were girls young, barely into womanhood, wrapped in torn blankets, their dark hair tangled with frost. Apache, by the looks of them. Their faces were pale from cold, lips blue, steps uncertain. One stumbled, and the other caught her before they both collapsed into the drift near the gate. John cursed softly, torn between caution and compassion. In this land, an Apache meant danger not by their nature, but by the war that still burned beneath the fragile peace. Yet he couldn't watch them die. "Easy now," he said, voice low but firm, approaching with his hands raised. They flinched at the sound, eyes wide with fear. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he added, kneeling in the snow. One of them whispered something in Apache, her voice thin as the wind. He didn't understand the words, but he caught the meaning. The plea for help was the same in any tongue. Without hesitation, he lifted the first girl in his arms, light as a bundle of sticks, and carried her toward the cabin. The other followed, shivering violently, clutching a torn piece of buffalo hide around her shoulders. Inside, the warmth hit them like a wall. The girls huddled near the fire while John fetched a blanket and his last jar of honey for them to drink with hot water. He watched as color slowly returned to their faces. The older one, perhaps 16, had a proud, sharp look in her eyes even through the weakness. The younger, maybe 12, stared at him with curiosity and fear mixed together. "You're far from your people," he said quietly. She nodded, whispering in broken English, "Snow. Took horses. My sister sick." Her words came haltingly, but he understood enough. They were lost, separated from their tribe during a snowstorm, their ponies dead or scattered. He didn't ask more, there'd be time later. If they lived through the night, he tended the fire, watching the flames flicker against their faces. Their presence stirred memories he thought buried deep his own daughter. Gone these 5 winters past, and the nights he'd sat beside her sickbed, wishing someone stronger had been there to save her. Maybe these girls were a second chance, a test from the Almighty. When the older sister coughed and shivered, he knew what he had to do. "You'll freeze if you stay here," he muttered, pacing the floor. "The fort's 2 days away too far on foot, not in this weather." His gaze drifted to the barn where Tucker waited. The thought of losing that old horse twisted something in him. Tucker was all he had left, a friend, a companion through lonely years. But he also knew what would happen if he did nothing. He pulled on his coat and stepped back into the storm. The snow stung his face as he reached the barn and laid a hand on Tucker's neck. "Old boy," he whispered, voice cracking. "Looks like your trail's about to end a good way." The horse snorted, as if understanding. John led him to the cabin door, where the girls looked up in confusion. He gestured toward the saddle. He's strong, sure-footed. He'll carry you to safety. The older sister shook her head, tears freezing on her cheeks. You? Keep horse, she said, struggling with the words. We walk. But John shook his head firmly. You won't walk far. Take him head south to the river. Follow it. There's a settlement beyond the ridge. He pressed the reins into her hands. He's yours now. The older sister's eyes filled with disbelief, then gratitude so deep it silenced the room. She touched her chest, then pointed to him. You? Good man. He gave a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. Just doing what's right. As they mounted, he felt a heavy ache settle in his chest. Watching them ride off into the pale dawn, their figures swallowed by snow, he whispered to the wind, Be safe. Little ones. Tucker's steady gait carried them away until they were gone, and John stood alone again with only the sound of the wind and the fire behind him. He didn't know that by morning, that simple act of mercy would bring the world to his doorstep, and that the snow-covered hills would soon echo with the sound of hoofbeats numbering in the hundreds. The dawn came pale and brittle, like glass that might shatter under the weight of a single breath. John Merrick awoke to a strange quiet, too quiet, even for the high plains. The fire in the hearth had burned low, its last embers glowing like dying eyes, and his breath clouded the cold air inside the cabin. He sat up, rubbed the stiffness from his hands, and listened. No wind, no bird call, not even the distant creak of trees. Only silence thick enough to press against his ribs. Something in that stillness raised the hair on the back of his neck. Years of ranch life had taught him that nature's calm could hide a storm or worse. He reached for his coat, pulled it over his shoulders, and stepped outside. The world beyond the cabin door was washed in white light. Snow stretched to the horizon, glittering under the faint blush of sunrise. But it wasn't the beauty that stopped him, it was the tracks. Dozens of them, etched deep into the snow, hoof prints. Not from Tucker, these were fresh, heavy, and too many to count. His pulse kicked hard in his chest. The girls had only left hours ago. Had someone followed them? He moved forward, his boots crunching through the crusted snow, scanning the ridge beyond the barn dot, and then he saw them dot at first. They looked like shadows moving through mist. But as the light strengthened, their forms sharpened riders, one after another, their silhouettes stretching across the ridge line. Apache warriors. A line so long it seemed to have no end. 200, maybe more, their ponies' breath steaming like ghosts in the frigid air. They came in silence, their movement steady and purposeful. John froze in place, heart thundering. He'd heard stories of raids of ranches burned, of men disappearing into the snow. But this was different. There was no shouting, no charging. Just a quiet, deliberate approach that felt almost ceremonial, like the earth itself was holding its breath. He stood his ground, though every instinct screamed to run. Running would be foolish. There was nowhere to go. The Apache had already surrounded the cabin. He could see them now, men wrapped in furs and deerskin, boughs slung across their backs, rifles gleaming dull in the gray light. Their faces were painted, but their expressions unreadable. One rider broke from the group and came forward slowly, his posture tall, regal. He rode a white horse, the animal's coat glistening like frost. Around his shoulders hung a robe of buffalo hide, and his hair, streaked with silver, was bound with a red feather. Even before the rider spoke, John knew this was their leader. The old warrior dismounted, boots crunching softly. He stopped a few paces away, studying John in silence. The two men stood there, one white, one Apache, bound by the frozen air and the uneasy weight of history between them. Finally, the warrior spoke, his English slow but clear. "You are Merrick?" John nodded once, wary. "I am." The warrior's gaze flicked toward the barn, then back. My daughters came to this place last night." John's heart sank, though the tone was not angry. He nodded again. "They did. They were lost in the storm. I gave them shelter and sent them south this morning on my horse." A murmur rippled through the riders behind the chief, a sound like wind moving through dry grass. The old man raised his hand and silence fell again. "You gave them your horse," he repeated, as if tasting the words. John nodded. It was the only way they'd survive. The Apache chief studied him for a long moment, eyes dark and deep, like wells that had seen centuries of struggle. Then he said quietly, "A man who gives life when he has nothing left is rare in any world." His hand went to his chest. "I am Nantan Lobo, father of Ayana and Tessa. They live because of you." John exhaled slowly, the tension easing from his shoulders, though he didn't relax completely. "Glad to hear they made it," he said, voice rough. Nantan Lobo's expression softened slightly, the corners of his mouth lifting in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "They are safe with my people now. They told me of your kindness." He looked past John to the cabin, the small smoke trail curling from its chimney. "You are alone here." It wasn't a question. John gave a short nod. "Been that way a while." The Apache leader nodded, as if understanding something deeper than words. "Then perhaps the Great Spirit sent them to you for a reason." The two men stood in quiet for a moment, snowflakes drifting between them like ash from some unseen fire. Then the old chief turned and signaled. Instantly, two young warriors dismounted, carrying something between them, a hide bundle, heavy and carefully tied. They set it down at John's feet and stepped back. The chief gestured toward it. "For you." John hesitated, kneeling to untie the straps. Inside was a wealth beyond anything he'd seen since the war-thick furs. Dried meat, cornmeal, herbs, even a small pouch of silver pieces. His throat tightened. "I can't take this," he said quietly. "You owe me nothing." But Nantan Lobo shook his head. "Among my people, debt is not in silver. It is in spirit. You gave a father his daughters back. Such things must be honored." The wind rose then, sighing through the pines like a prayer. The warriors remained still, waiting. Nantan Lobo stepped closer, his eyes searching John's face. "You are not like the others who come to our land. You understand what honor means." He extended his hand, scarred and weathered but steady. John hesitated only a moment before taking it. Their hands met, two worlds colliding in a grip that held the weight of peace between them. "If ever you need us," the chief said, "light a fire on this ridge. We will come." He reached into his robe and handed John a small carved token, a piece of bone shaped like an eagle, marked with red ochre. "Keep this. It is my word." John closed his hand around the token, feeling its smooth surface warm against his skin. "I'll keep it safe," he said. The chief nodded once, then turned to mount his horse. As he swung into the saddle, he looked back at the rancher. "You have the heart of an Apache, Merrick," he said. "The snow may take many things, but not the fire that lives inside a man." With that, he raised his arm, and the line of riders began to move silent, ghostly, their figures fading into the swirling snow as if swallowed by the earth itself. John stood there long after they vanished, the token clutched tight in his fist. The valley was quiet again, but not empty. Something had changed in the air, something sacred and invisible, binding him forever to the people he had once feared. As the sun rose higher, the light touched the token in his hand, glinting faintly like the first spark of spring in a world of endless winter. He looked toward the south, where two young riders had disappeared the night before, and whispered, "Ride safe, girls. You brought more warmth to this place than I ever thought I'd feel again." The snow didn't stop that day. It thickened, swallowing the valley in white fury. By afternoon, The world had vanished beyond a curtain of drifting flakes, and John Merrick found himself fighting against the cold once more. The Apache had gone at dawn, but their presence lingered like the memory of a dream too vivid to forget, too strange to believe. He'd stood by his door for nearly an hour after they left, watching the snow cover their tracks, wondering if he'd imagined it all. Yet the bundle of goods inside his cabin told him it had been real. The hides, the food, the small carved token, all proof that sometimes mercy returned like an echo across the plains. He spent the morning preparing for the storm that threatened to bury him alive. The snow came down heavy and wet, piling fast on the roof and drifting against the doors. He brought in more wood, sealed the cracks with cloth, and tried to keep the fire alive. But as night crept in, the wind rose to a scream, battering the walls as if some ancient spirit had come to test his resolve. The old rancher sat by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the storm's rage. Loneliness pressed on him harder than the cold. He thought of the girls, Ayanna and Tessa, their faces pale with frost, their eyes bright with courage. He wondered if they had made it safely to their people's camp. A small smile touched his lips as he imagined their father's joy at seeing them alive. Maybe, he thought, that's worth more than any horse. But as the hours dragged, a sound cut through the storm, a deep groan from the barn. He froze. The roof was old, patched too many times. He threw on his coat, grabbed the lantern, and pushed through the blizzard. The wind tore at his clothes, biting through the seams, but he pressed on, one arm raised to shield his face. The barn loomed like a dark ghost in the storm, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. He forced the door open just as a beam cracked above. He lunged forward, knocking aside a falling plank. The lantern flickered, light spilling across the stalls empty, save for the ghosts of what once filled them. Tucker's absence cut deep. The barn felt hollow without that steady warmth, without the sound of breathing that had kept him company through long winters. For a moment, the weight of his choice hit him like a hammer. He had given away his last companion to save two strangers. And now, alone in the heart of the storm, he felt every inch of that sacrifice. He turned to leave, but then he heard it faint at first, buried beneath the wind. A sound like distant thunder. Hoofbeats? He frowned, stepping outside into the storm again, straining to listen. No, couldn't be. No man could ride through this blizzard. But the sound grew louder, closer, until it filled the valley with a steady rhythm, dozens, maybe hundreds of horses. His first thought was panic. Raiders? Soldiers? But then, through the curtain of snow, lanterns appeared, soft yellow glows moving like stars through fog. He backed up, heart racing. And then he saw them, Apache riders, cloaked in fur, their faces wrapped against the storm. At their head was Nanton Lobo. John could barely believe his eyes. The chief dismounted near the barn, snow crusting his shoulders. "Merrick," he called, his voice cutting through the wind. "You are in danger here. The storm is too strong. We come to help." John shook his head in disbelief. "You came back?" The chief nodded once. "You gave life to my daughters. We give life to you." Behind him, his warriors were already moving, unloading supplies, stacking wood, covering the roof with hides to keep it from collapsing. Some led their ponies to shelter, others helped patch cracks in the cabin walls. It was an army of quiet strength, moving with purpose and unity, guided by gratitude. John stood speechless, the storm swirling around him like a living thing. He felt a hand on his shoulder, the chief's grip, steady and warm. "You gave without asking," Nanton Lobo said. "Now you will see what it means to receive." For a long moment, the two men locked eyes, and John felt something shift deep inside him, a humbling, almost sacred connection. He had thought kindness was a small thing, something done and forgotten. But now he saw how far a single act could ripple across the world. As night fell, the Apache built a great fire outside the cabin. The snow still fell, but it seemed gentler now, softened by the glow. The warriors sat in a circle, their voices low as they shared food and stories. John joined them, sitting close enough to feel the heat. The youngest warriors watched him with curiosity, while the older ones nodded in silent respect. One of them passed him a bowl of hot broth made from elk and herbs. The taste nearly brought tears to his eyes. It had been months since he'd eaten something that warm, that full of life. Nanton Lobo sat across from him, face lit by the flames. "You remind me of a man I once knew," he said quietly. "A white trader who treated us with honor. He too believed that giving makes a man strong. He died in peace." John swallowed hard, feeling the fire's warmth spread through his bones. "Peace," he murmured. "That's a rare thing in these lands." The chief nodded slowly. "Only rare because men forget how to earn it." Later that night, when the others had settled, John stepped away from the fire. He looked out over the valley, where the snow glimmered faintly under the moon. The storm had finally broken. Stars blinked overhead, sharp and cold. Behind him, the Apache sang softly low chants that rose and fell with the rhythm of the earth. He listened, feeling the music seep into his soul. It was strange and haunting, but beautiful. For the first time in years, he felt something like peace stirring within him. Maybe it wasn't just the warmth of the fire, or the company of men who had once been enemies. It was the understanding that the world could still surprise him with grace. As he stood there, Nanton Lobo joined him, holding something in his hand. It was Tucker's bridle. "Your horse lives," the chief said, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. "My daughter sent him back. They said he knows your heart." John took the bridle with trembling hands, unable to speak. Somewhere beyond the ridge, he heard a familiar neigh. He turned, and there through the mist Tucker appeared, trotting slowly toward him, mane shimmering with frost. John laughed, a rough, broken sound of disbelief and joy. The horse stopped beside him, nudging his shoulder as if scolding him for the trouble. John threw his arms around the animal's neck, whispering, "You old fool. You came home." The chief smiled, watching the reunion in silence. "Some bonds," he said softly, "are not broken by snow or distance." John looked up at him, eyes wet. "Thank you," he said simply. The chief nodded once. "We do not thank for what is right. We only remember it." Then he turned back to his people, leaving John standing with Tucker beneath the stars. The night stretched quiet and calm. The snow had stopped. And for the first time in years, John Merrick felt alive, not just surviving, but part of something larger than himself. The Apache had come not as avengers, but as brothers in spirit. In the endless winter of the frontier, a single act of mercy had kindled a fire that no storm could ever put out. The days that followed felt like living inside a dream that didn't quite belong to the same world John Merrick had known before. The snow, once the enemy of life, became a quiet blanket that softened the valley's scars. Each morning, the sun crept a little higher, its warmth timid but certain, melting the frost from the eaves of the cabin. The Apache remained through the thaw, their presence a living reminder that the frontier could still hold miracles. They hunted the hills, mended his fences, split his logs, and shared their stories by the fire each night. John found himself listening more than speaking. Drawn in by the rhythms of their voices, songs and legends older than the land itself. It was strange. He thought how quickly walls could fall when men saw each other as human instead of as history's shadows. The first few nights had been cautious, quiet, his English slow, their words careful. But soon, laughter began to echo around the campfire. He learned their names: Gray Hawk, who could track a deer through a blizzard; Laughing Fox, whose jokes cut through even the coldest nights, and Iron Eyes, a stoic young man who carried the patience of stone. Ayanna and Tessa, the two sisters he had saved, returned often with their father. They always brought gifts, dried berries, wild herbs, and smiles brighter than the snow. Ayanna especially had a spark in her that reminded John painfully of his own daughter. When she laughed, it was like the sound of melted ice running over smooth rock, clear, bright, full of life. Sometimes, when she and her sister sat by the hearth and told stories of their people's spirits, John would close his eyes and listen, feeling something mend deep inside him. The land, too, began to heal. The snow melted into clear streams that glittered across the valley floor, feeding the thirsty ground. Patches of green pushed through the white, timid at first, then bold. Birds returned to the trees. The cattle, those that had survived the winter, wandered cautiously from the sheds, lowing softly as they found grass again. Life, against all odds, had returned. John worked beside the Apache men, rebuilding the corrals and mending fences, though they often refused his thanks. "Work keeps the heart warm," one of them said with a grin. No need for words. They taught him to weave ropes from yucca fibers, to read the direction of the wind by the way the snow melted on pine bark. In return, he showed them how to fix the iron traps, how to use the forge in his barn. Two worlds, once divided by suspicion, now worked side by side, and neither seemed to care much for who owned which tradition. Every night, as the stars shimmered above the ridges, John found himself reflecting on how life could change with one decision. He had given away his last horse expecting nothing, and now that same horse grazed contentedly beside the Apache ponies while his once empty ranch thrummed with life and laughter. He'd thought himself a man finished with the world, hollowed out by loss and years of silence. But in giving, he'd somehow been given back far more. The feeling wasn't pride, but something humbler, purer peace. A peace that came not from wealth or solitude, but from connection. Nanton Lobo, too, had changed in those weeks. Though still commanding and wise, there was a warmth in him now that hadn't been there before. He often walked with John at sunset, the two men speaking little but understanding much. One evening, as they stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, Nanton Lobo said softly, "You see how the land heals itself after the storm? Men can do the same." John nodded, his gaze on the horizon. "Took me a long time to learn that lesson." The chief smiled faintly. "It takes most men longer than the earth." They shared a laugh, two old souls from different worlds bound by the same truth. That night, the tribe prepared a feast to honor the coming of spring. Fires blazed in a wide circle outside the cabin, and the air filled with the scent of roasted meat and pine. The Apache women sang, their voices rising and falling like wind over the canyons. Children danced barefoot in the thawing snow. Ayanna and Tessa moved gracefully among them, their laughter carrying across the clearing. John sat by the main fire, feeling the warmth soak into his bones. The chief sat beside him, nodding toward the girls. "My daughters live because of you," he said quietly. "They say your spirit walks with ours now." John smiled, shaking his head. "They gave me more life than I gave them." The chief considered this, then said, "When a man saves another, he saves a piece of himself. The Great Spirit sees such things." As the feast went on, John shared a story of his own, the tale of his wife and daughter, of how the fever had taken them and left him hollow. The Apache listened in silence, their eyes full of understanding. When he finished, Ayanna reached across the fire and placed her hand gently on his arm. "Your daughter," she said softly, "she still walks with you. She sent us to your door that night." The words struck him deep, a warmth spreading through the ache that had lived in his chest for years. He couldn't reply, his throat too tight, but his eyes told her everything. She smiled, and in that moment, The pain that had ruled his life for so long began to fade into something gentler. The night ended with music. The Apache drummers beat their steady rhythm against the earth, and one by one, the others joined the dance. John hesitated at first, but Ayanna laughed and pulled him to his feet. He stumbled, awkward and unsure, and she laughed harder, teaching him the steps. The warriors clapped and cheered, and for a man who had forgotten how to live, John found himself laughing until tears streaked his cheeks. Around them, snow melted into mud, and stars wheeled overhead like watchful eyes. The frontier, for once, felt like home. When dawn came, the valley shimmered with gold. Frost clung to the grass, sparkling like diamonds. The Apache prepared to move north, following the herds, their camp breaking down in quiet rhythm. John helped where he could, though his chest tightened at the thought of their leaving. When Nanton Lobo mounted his horse, he turned to John and said, "We return before the next winter. The land remembers good friends." He paused, then added, "You are welcome among my people, always." John nodded, the words catching in his throat. "Safe travels," he managed, and "Thank you." The chief touched his chest in the Apache gesture of respect. "We walk the same road now, Merrick. Different feet, same trail." As the riders disappeared into the hills, John stood long after they'd gone, watching the last traces of snow melt under the rising sun. The valley was alive again. His fences stood strong, his hearth burned bright, and Tucker grazed peacefully beside the creek. For the first time in many years, John Merrick felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. He turned toward his cabin, the eagle token hanging around his neck, and smiled. The world had been cruel once, but now it had repaid him with something better than wealth or comfort. It had given him belonging. The seasons turned gently in the high plains, and time, as it often does in places untouched by hurry, began to blur. Spring gave way to summer, and the valley bloomed like a forgotten paradise. The meadows grew thick with wildflowers yellow as gold, blue as sky, and Tucker ran free through the grass, his coat sleek and shining again. John Merrick's ranch, once silent as a grave, now rang with the rhythm of life. The fences stood tall, the barns were full, and the man who had once lived as a ghost among the hills had found reason to wake each morning. He had no wife, no children, but he had something rarer purpose, and a peace that no man could buy. The Apache came often that summer. Small hunting parties would appear at the ridgeline, their silhouettes painted against the evening sky, and John would meet them with coffee and bread by the fire. They traded meat and hides for tools, shared stories, and sometimes stayed for days. Among them was Ayanna, now blooming into womanhood, her laughter still bright as sunlight on snow. She had a way of seeing the world that made even silence feel full. She spoke to John often about her people's beliefs, about the spirits of the land, about how every act of kindness echoed through generations. "You gave a gift to the wind," she told him once, smiling. The wind carried it back. He had no clever reply, only a quiet nod. For in his heart he knew she was right. As autumn deepened, the valley's colors turned amber, rust, and crimson, painting the slopes. The air grew thin and crisp, and John began to feel the bite of winter in his bones again. But this year he didn't dread it. He stacked wood higher, prepared his stores, and when the first snow fell, it felt like an old friend returning, not an enemy. One night, as flakes drifted down soft as feathers, he sat by the hearth, staring into the fire. On the mantel lay the carved eagle token, worn smooth from months of being carried close to his heart. He turned it over in his palm and thought of the chief's words, "If ever you need us, light a fire on the ridge." It was deep night when a distant sound woke him, the echo of hooves against frozen earth. He rose quickly, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside. The moon hung full above the ridge, painting the valley silver. And there they were, Apache riders descending through the snow, their torches bright against the dark. At their head rode Nanton Lobo, tall and steady as always, his hair now fully gray beneath his fur hood. Behind him, Ayana rode, her braids swinging in rhythm with her horse's stride. They came not as an army this time, but as family. Merrick. The chief called, his deep voice rolling across the snow. The cold returns, and we bring what the earth has given us. They dismounted, and his people began unloading bundles, dried meat, cornmeal, hides, medicines. The same gifts John had once refused returned now without expectation. He felt his throat tighten as he watched them pile the goods high against his porch. "You've done too much," he said softly, shaking his head. The chief smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "You gave when you had nothing. Now we give because we have plenty. This is how the circle stays whole." They shared the evening by the fire, just as before, the warmth and laughter wrapping around them like a blanket. Ayana sat near the flames, her eyes reflecting the light. She sang softly a song in her people's tongue, one John couldn't understand, but it stirred something deep in him nonetheless. The notes rose like smoke into the rafters, curling through the night. When she finished, she looked at him and said, "It is a song for those who walk alone and are found again." John smiled, his eyes damp. "Then it's my song," he said quietly, as dawn touched the valley. Painting the snow in hues of rose and gold, Nanton Lobo approached him one last time. "We leave when the sun climbs higher," he said. "The herds move east." John nodded, though a pang of sadness tugged at him. "You'll come back when the snow melts?" The chief smiled. "If the Great Spirit wills it. But whether we stand here or beyond the mountains, our friendship stays." He placed a hand on John's shoulder, firm and warm. "You are one of us now, Merrick. The land knows your heart." Before they rode out, Ayana approached with a bundle wrapped in deerskin. "For you," she said softly. Inside was a finely woven blanket, dyed in red and white patterns that shimmered in the light. "My mother made it," she explained. "It will keep you warm when the snows grow deep." John touched the fabric reverently, unable to speak. "Thank you," he finally whispered. She smiled, and there was something in her eyes, something beyond gratitude, beyond friendship. A quiet promise, perhaps, or simply the recognition of a bond that words could never define. When the Apache departed, their figures melting into the snowy horizon, John stood alone once more. Yet he didn't feel the same hollow ache he once had. Instead, there was fullness, as if the valley itself breathed with him. Days turned into weeks, snow deepened, and life fell into rhythm again. He worked the ranch, tended the cattle, and each night he sat by the fire with the eagle token in hand. Sometimes he imagined hearing the distant sound of drums in the wind, or the soft laughter of two girls on horseback. And he smiled, knowing they were real. That winter was harsh, but it didn't break him. When blizzards howled, he thought of the Apache circle of fire, of the warmth they had shared. He wore Ayana's blanket around his shoulders, its colors bright against the gray cold. And when loneliness crept in, he stepped outside, looked up at the stars, and whispered thanks to the land, to the spirits, to those who had walked through snow to bring him back to life. One morning, near the end of the season, he saddled Tucker and rode out across the ridge. The world was white and silent, the sun low on the horizon. The valley stretched before him, endless and familiar. He rode slowly, savoring every crunch of snow beneath Tucker's hooves, every breath of cold air. At the highest point, he stopped and dismounted, lighting a small fire with the last of his matches. The smoke rose thin into the sky. He smiled, remembering the words, "If ever you need us, light a fire on this ridge." Far away, beyond the hills, faint against the wind, came the sound of answering hoofbeats, steady, sure, growing closer. John laughed softly, eyes glistening. Guess the Great Spirit does keep his word. As the shapes emerged from the snow Apache riders coming once more, John Merrick stood tall against the dawn, his coat whipping in the wind, his heart alive with gratitude. The snow no longer felt cold. It felt like memory pure white, forgiving. The man who had once given everything he had left had gained everything that mattered. And on that endless, gleaming morning, the rancher and the warriors rode side by side once more, brothers beneath the same sky, bound forever by the gift of kindness and the warmth of a single selfless act.